Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers and dear students. In today's video, I'll be discussing about the foreign policy, what is a foreign policy, and then what are some of the major elements or what are some of the determinants of a foreign policy or the influencing factors of a foreign policy. If you have watched my previous videos about the national interest, the national power and diplomacy, then it will be very easy for you to understand this one. So if you haven't gone through those videos, just go through them, and then there are many concepts in those videos which I will not be elaborating over here. I have elaborated them already over there in those videos. So this understanding this lecture or this topic would be easy for you if you go through those videos before listening to this one. Okay, as you all know, since you are the students of international relations, or at least you are the ones who have got some interest in international politics and international relations, so you know that it is the basic right of every state to strive for the achievements of its national interest, right? And it is the duty of the state as well to strive to achieve the national interest, because it is the right of the people that the government strive to do so, right? So that is why it is the duty of a nation, and that is why we see these foreign policies of every nation. They are revolving, or they revolve around their national interest. Now, I will be going through various definitions of the foreign policy, but just for your general understanding, by foreign policy, what do we mean by this term? This is just for general understanding. The definitions would come in a while. I will discuss them in a while. So foreign policy of a nation is always made and implemented with an eye on the situation in various regions of the world. It is not possible to formulate the foreign policy of a country in isolation. So whenever a country formulates its foreign policy, it will have to take into account various developments in different regions of the globe. Only then that foreign policy will be a good, we will call it a good foreign policy. Otherwise, we will not call it a good foreign policy. Another thing which is very important before going into a debate about the nature of foreign policy and its determinants or elements, you need to understand that it is an era of interdependence. No state is completely independent or completely self-sufficient or self-reliant. It always relies on other states. Every state, may it be a small state, a powerful state, a weak state, a big state, it relies on other states because it is an era of interdependence. And even before this era, it isn't possible for a people to live in isolation, because we have just this one globe and we share resources with other countries, with other people. So then if you are sharing these resources, then we will definitely have to take help from them, or we will have to share it with them in order for them to share it with us as well. So this is how it works in international relations. Now, in order to give a meaning and direction to relations, for a country, in order to give meaning and relation to her relations, or meaning or direction to her relations with another country, it needs to formulate or adopt a foreign policy. So this is how it is. Let me clarify this again. For any given country, in order to give direction to its relations with other countries, it needs to formulate a foreign policy, or a set of policies, or a set of or a course of action, which we then call the foreign policy. So this is just for general understanding of the foreign policy. Then the behavior of every nation in international system is conditioned by its foreign policy, or the behavior of nations is conditioned by their foreign policies. So this is how we evaluate a country. We come to know about the behavior of a country by looking towards its foreign policy. What does it do on the foreign policy front? Then we come to know about it. Now that was just a general definition. Now what is foreign policy? Like that was general definition, but if we just want to be specific, to be more specific, now what is a foreign policy? So foreign policy is a set of principles, decisions and means adopted and followed by a nation for securing her goals of national interest. So again, over here you need to understand this concept of national interest before understanding this, because I'll not be explaining this national interest over here. I have already explained it in a video lecture of about 1 hour and 23 minutes or something. So about 83 minutes, I guess. That was a video lecture of 83 minutes. So you can understand this national interest, this concept of national interest over there. So in order for a country to achieve its national interest in international system or international relations, whatever means, whatever policies, whatever measures it takes or it adopts, that is its foreign policy. Then the foreign policy defines the goals of the national interest. Like national interest is a big thing, so then there are some goals and objectives of the national interest. So this is the foreign policy which defines these goals of national interest, and then the state exercise their national power in order to achieve those goals. So the concept of national interest has already been elaborated in one of my previous talks, and the concept of national power has also been elaborated in one of my previous talks. So I will not be elaborating these concepts again over here. What are some of the definitions by different authors or by different scholars or academicians of foreign policy? These definitions are given by different scholars, academicians. So what are some of these definitions of foreign policy? Number one, I'll read it from here so that you can understand it in its letter and spirit. Foreign policy is the system of activities evolved by communities for changing the behavior of other states and for adjusting their own activities to the international environment. Right? Then another definition of foreign policy is that it is the substance of nations' efforts to promote its interest vis-a-vis other nations. So you use your foreign policy to promote your interest against another country, right? Then again, another definition is foreign policy is the key element in the process by which a state translates its broadly conceived goals and interest into concrete courses of action to attain these objectives and preserve its interest, right? So that's it. Another definition, whatever courses of action a state adopts in order to achieve its objectives, that is what we call these objectives in international system or in its international relations. Then we call it the foreign policy. So these objectives are called the foreign policy. These courses of action are called the foreign policy of a country. The objectives are there to be achieved through these courses of action. Then another definition is that foreign policy is a thought out course of action for achieving objectives in foreign relations as dictated by the national interest. So whatever objectives are dictated by the national interest, foreign policy is a course of action devised by the policy makers to achieve these objectives. I hope this point has been made clear. So by keeping in view the above definitions and some general explanation about the foreign policy, now you can easily say that the foreign policy of each nation or each country contains some of the following things, these followings which I am explaining right now. A set of principles, policies and decisions that are adopted and these are followed by a nation in international relations. Set of principles, policies and decisions adopted by nations, right? Then again, number 2, that is the objectives, the goals or the aims of national interest. So foreign policy contains the objectives, the goals or the aims of national interest. Point number 3, that is the means which are to be used for achieving the goals of national interest. So foreign policy is a set of means which states use to achieve the goals of national interest. And then principles and policy, or policy principles which are adopted in international relations. Simple. Then another point is that it is the assessment of the gains and failures of the nation in respect of its goals of national interest. So this assessment is also there in foreign policy. You assess your foreign policies. How do you say that the foreign policy was good or bad? Because you assess it. So when you assess, this assessment process is there, it is inbuilt in the foreign policy. So when somebody assesses, a student or a scholar or a policymaker assesses the foreign policy of a certain country, so that is also this foreign policy, this assessment mechanism should also be there in the foreign policy. And then there are some set of indicators, and then you can assess it by looking towards those indicators and then coming to the conclusion whether those indicators have been met or not, achieved or not, the objectives have been met or not, achieved or not, right? Then again, the foreign policy analyzes the actions of a state towards external environment, like the other states. By the external environment we mean the other states, and the conditions usually domestic under which those actions are formulated. So actions of the state towards the external environment, and then the conditions within the state which influence these actions or these policies. So it is these kind of things which I think that everyone should know, and I think it's not difficult, it's not that difficult if you just think over it. It is almost the same thing which I am repeating in different words. So it is just to elaborate these things for you so that you understand this topic very well. Okay, and again one more thing which you need to keep it in mind, that the study of the foreign policy is not only it doesn't only look towards the objectives of the national interest or the goals of the national interest, but it is also an assessment of the means which have been adopted towards, or assessment of the steps which have been taken towards the achievement of those goals or those interests, right? So summing it up, foreign policy is a set of principles and decisions, a plan of action and a thought out course of action adopted and used by a nation for conducting relations with other nations and all international actors with a view to secure the preferred and defined goals of her national interest. This last sentence, it sums it up, right? You can listen to it again, it sums it up. Now, what are some of the determinants, or what are some of the elements, or what are some of the influencing factors of foreign policy? And now this part is quite easy. I hope everybody who has gone through the national interest, the national power, will be able to understand this one, because it is not that different from those elements of national power, and particularly those elements of national power. So the determinants, not that, like, it is different, but not that much different from it. So if you have understood those elements of national power, or determinants of national power, so determinants of foreign policy would be quite easy for you. Now, foreign policy of a nation is formulated and implemented by its policymakers, but they do take into consideration or take into account certain aspects while formulating those policies, or while devising those courses of action. They do take into account certain determinants or certain external or internal factors. Now, what are those internal and external factors? And then they also take into account the international power structure. So we will be talking about those internal and external determinants, you might call it, and then the international power structure. We will be discussing these things. Number one thing which is among those determinants is again size of a state or the territory of a state. So it was also one of the determinants of the national power, right? So the size of a state is also very important in the foreign policy formulation of a country. But again, you need to take it in to keep it in your mind that size is not the only determinant which determines the foreign policy. It is dependent on many other aspects. At times you might see, again the same discussion, at times you might see that there is a country with a huge size, with a large size, but its foreign policy is quite weak because of lack of resources in that size. And then in this size or territory, the population also matters. So if the population is great, the size is great, and then the other resources are available, then it is likely, the likelihood is that country would become, or that country would have the potential to be a great power or a superpower. You can talk about it in these terms as well. But if some of those elements which I have just mentioned, if some of them are missing, so then this only determinant like this power which we are discussing right now, not power, the size which we are discussing right now, it doesn't determine or it doesn't influence the foreign policy that effectively, because you can think about different countries which are of small size. For example, countries in the Middle East. The Middle Eastern countries, they are not that much big in size, but they have the resources of oil with them. So when they have these resources of oil with them, so their small size, though like by this definition or by this determinant, they should be weak countries, but since they have the resources of the oil, so they use this oil diplomacy in order to have an upper edge in all negotiations and mold the policies of different nations, which might be larger in size than the Middle East, than any other country in the Middle East. But still, these small countries like Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, these are small countries. Saudi Arabia is not that small, but the rest of the countries which I have just named, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, these are small countries. But still, these countries influence large countries because of their resources. So they have got, we will be discussing what are those other aspects which are important. Okay, sorry for the disturbance. So then there is another drawback of the large size is that if there are no natural boundaries with the large size, then it will be difficult for a country to defend itself, because there are no natural boundaries like mountains, rivers, seas. So if these these natural boundaries are not there, artificial boundaries are drawn, so then it becomes difficult for the country to maintain or take care of that huge territory of which is in its possession. Another factor is that geographical factor. So it is also one of the most important factors of the foreign policy, or one of the most important determinants of the foreign policy. It is the topography of the land, its fertility, the climate, the location, and many other things, but these are some of the prominent things which we include in the geography of a country, particularly the location. So you can see, I have already explained this thing, that the English Channel had played a vital role in making the United Kingdom or England a strong country in the 18th and the 19th century, because it compelled the UK to develop a good navy, and when it developed a good navy, then it was ruling the seas, and whoever rules the seas becomes a big power. So it was one of the that location was one of the factors in making the UK as one of the big powers. And again, the Atlantic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, they have contributed a lot for the United States of America to become a big power, because then it had to cross all those seas to reach out to the rest of the world, and in the process it developed its huge navy, its big navy, its powerful navy. So it is now ruling the world on the basis of its navy. And you might be amazed to know that the United States of America, the US Navy has got bigger budget, that is I think $210 billion, as compared to the US Army budget, which is 197 or 93 billion dollars. So they are spending more on their defense, on the Navy, because they are a superpower, or they were a superpower just because of their Navy. So and the Navy was due to the location of the United States of America. So that is why the location is very important. Again, another factor in the location, you can see that the foreign policy of Pakistan has been determined by its location. Pakistan is in South Asia. Its location is that in the neighborhood we have got an enemy. Then Afghanistan is not that friendly with us again. So then we have got Iran and we have got China. So whatever foreign policy we have got right now, it is influenced, highly influenced by our location. Right? Just imagine, we would not be having good relations with China had we not been a neighbor of China. We would not be that much concerned about Afghanistan had we not been in the neighborhood of Afghanistan. And then likewise, animosity with India and over the issue of Kashmir. So it is all due to the location. Again, natural resources, in the natural resources, which is part of the geography, that food production capacity of a nation is directly linked to its geography. So food production capacity is very important. I have discussed in some of my previous talks that food quality and self-sufficiency or self-reliance or self-sufficiency in food is very much important in order to have a strong army even. So that is why it is important. And then if you can see that in the 1950s and 60s there was a food shortage, in particular in India and even up to some extent in Pakistan, and the foreign policies of both these countries during that time was shaped by the shortage of their food at their disposal. So it shapes the foreign policy of a country, right? Then again, in resources, as I was discussing in the under the discussion of size, this oil is a resource and it is making these Gulf countries more powerful. So it is, part of the geography, you can call it. But there is a check on these location and all these things, that the development of communication and all the means of modern communication, they have overcome the hindrances or the challenges posed by the difficult terrain or difficult geographical location. Like, the United States of America came out from all the way from the United States of America and attacked Afghanistan. So it was due to its technological advancement, otherwise it would not have been able to do so. So it was due to its technological advancement. So it is kind of a check, or it has somehow up to some extent minimized dependency on the location, but that technological edge, if somebody has got it, only then. Otherwise, location matters a lot. Then the level and the nature of the economic development. So if you can see that the United States of America is a big economy, economically they are a developed country, so it is influencing other countries on the basis of its economy. When a country is economically powerful country, when it is economically powerful, then it is easy for that country to influence other countries. So the level of economic and the nature of economic development is also there. The level and nature of economic development also matters in your foreign policy considerations, and it formulates your foreign policy. Had the United States of America been a small country or economically weak country and technologically less advanced country, like not an industrialized country, we would not have seen this hawkish or aggressive foreign policy by it. But it is not the case right now. It is an economically powerful country, strong country, an industrialized country. So technology has also been developed over there. That is why we can see this aggression in its foreign policy, because it knows that it did not have a competitor on the world stage, so it could do whatever it wanted to do, like might is right even. Right? So, and then this foreign aid is used as a tool. Like if you are an economically powerful country, you can use the foreign aid as a tool to influence others' behavior, weak states' behavior. So that is why this development also matters, right? Again, and the lack of this development, like the new international economic order, which was presented as a result of the international economic order. This new international economic order and international economic order, it is a debate of the global political economy. So I'll be discussing that under that topic. But the new international economic order was adopted by the economically weak countries because they did not agree, or they were of the opinion that the rules and regulations of the international economic order were just to serve the purposes of the economically strong countries. So that is why the underdeveloped or the developing countries, they came up with another economic order which was termed as the new international economic order, and they presented their new international economic order, and all the weak and the developing countries, they revolve around that new international economic order because it served their interest, their economic interest. So talking about that, so you can see that the behavior was again of even the weak countries was again determined by the level and the nature of economic development. It was not that much developed. These countries were not that much developed, so their behavior was conditioned by the level of their development, and the behavior of the rich countries was conditioned by the level of the development of the rich countries. So economy plays an important role, or the level of economic development plays an important role in formulating or shaping the foreign policy of any given country. Then cultural and historical determinants, or cultural or historical factors, they also play a vital role in the formulation of foreign policy or determining the foreign policy of a country. How do they do it? You know, the cultural heritage of a country and the history of a nation, they both play important role. Culturally, those countries who are culturally similar, you would find that they would have good relations with each other. For example, take the example of Pakistan with the rest of the Muslim countries, and then you will come to know that it is because of the Muslim culture in Pakistan that Pakistan always tries to have good relations with the Muslim countries. And I don't see any Muslim country towards which Pakistan has got some aggressive designs. So there is no Muslim country as such. That is because of the cultural influence. And then history also determines your foreign policy. So just see the history of Muslims in the subcontinent with the Hindus and with the non-Muslim, particularly with the Hindus before partition, and you will see that even after the partition, this historical factor is determining our foreign policies. But there are certain times, or there are certain instances in which you can see that historical differences have been overcome. Like for example, for instance, the European Union, France and Germany, they had animosity, the great wars, you know, World War I and World War II. So they were the major players in that, and they had animosity towards each other. But then they came to know that they should bury the hatchet, and They should not fight with each other anymore, and they should be more focused on the economic development, and then the European common market, and then the European Union. So we can see that this thing, if hostility is there in the history, that hostility can be overcome through different means. So that is why we cannot say that historical factors cannot be forgotten, or historical facts, if they are some harsh facts, harsh realities, so even they can be forgotten and overcome in the larger interest of the people. Then social structure also plays an important role. The structure and nature of a society for which the foreign policy operates is also an important element, right? So if a society, for example, if the social structure of a society is such that it is ripe with conflict, then we will see that the foreign policy of that country would not be very effective, very vibrant, because there is internal strife, internal conflict prevailing in that society. The fault lines are there. So if the fault lines in the society are there, then that society is internally weak. I think you're getting me. That society is internally weak. So if the society is internally weak, then that society or that country will not be in a better position to devise, to formulate a good and vibrant foreign policy and then execute it, like a good foreign policy and then vibrantly execute it. So it will not be in a better position. On the other hand, a unified society, we can see a unified society, their foreign policies are always good. Take the example of China. Though it is a huge country, but it is a unified society. There are no cultural differences at large prevailing in China, apart from this one issue, which is the Uyghur Muslims. But the rest of the Chinese people, they do not have such kind of cultural differences. There is one political party, and that one political party rules the whole country, and the leadership changes, but there is one political party. And even these political differences are not there, and then people are likely, they have their own economic interests, they are hardworking people. So you can see a very good foreign policy from China. It is because a unified society is there. And then take the example of for example, just take the example of India or Pakistan. When we compare these societies with the Chinese society, does not allow this social division, and this conflict does not allow these countries to come up with a vibrant foreign policy. They are always under pressure from different groups. May these groups be small in their nature, in their size, but still they are very much influenced by these groups. And so this social structure or the social aspects of a society also determine the foreign policy of a country. Then what is the governance structure in a country? So if the governance structure is such in which accountability is there and people keep an eye or a check on the foreign policy of a country, only then that country would be the foreign policy of that country would be seen as a good foreign policy, and that country would be able to formulate a good foreign policy. And if the governance structure or the government structure in that country is somehow not up to the mark, and there are different parts of the government, and if these parts are not functioning well, then the foreign policy of that country would be, you might see the reflection of the government structure in the foreign policy of that country as well. There are many instances in which the foreign minister of a country would say one thing, but then voices from within the parliament would be raised against those foreign policy measures, and then those measures would be taken back by the government. So all these things are, they are related to the government structure. And even if the foreign policy is formulated well, if the government is lacking in the implementation mechanism of that foreign policy, even then it would be problematic for that. So that is why the structure of the government matters a lot. And then the nature of the legislature and the executive relations also matter. So if the legislature and the executive relations are not good, like in the US, so then many foreign policy decisions would not be ratified by the Congress or the legislature. These decisions would have been taken by the executive, like the decision of the United States of America to formulate a world body, to form a world body, the League of Nations, but then the US Congress did not ratify that decision. So the United States of America could not become a member of the League of Nations, though it was the idea of Woodrow Wilson. So it is also like this. So we need to keep in mind about the nature of the government in a country. It also influences the foreign policy formulation process. Then again, what is the internal situation of a country? For example, there might be sudden changes in a country's internal situations. There might be disturbances in a country situation, disorders might occur. Then some other unforeseen events, like for example, a natural calamity might struck the country. So all these things, they can be reflected in the foreign policy of a country. Take the example of Pakistan. Like Pakistan, you can see there are numerous instances in the foreign policy of Pakistan which were basically governed by these internal issues or internal conflicts or internal disorder in Pakistan. For example, when the natural calamities strike in Pakistan, we always see that Pakistan goes to the international financial institutions and different economically developed countries, and then Pakistan asks for economic aid in order to cope with those challenges. So in order to get that economic aid, Pakistan compromises on its some of its measures, foreign policy measures. Pakistan somehow tries to mold its foreign policy according to the wishes and demands of the donor countries. So these internal situations, they matter. Then Pakistan foreign policy, again you can say that the internal situation in Pakistan was such after the 9/11 that Pervez Musharraf was the president of the country at that time, and he was the chief executive of the country at that time. So the internal situation of the country was such that it was posed with a challenge, and Pervez Musharraf had already taken over the government. So there was a change in the government, and then it was easy for the government to adopt that policy option, which later on proved to be fatal for the country. Not fatal, but very detrimental for the country. So luckily not fatal, but quite detrimental for the country. So these internal things, these internal factors, this internal environment of a country, it plays a vital role in determining your foreign policy. So if the internal environment is good, if the situation is not that of a conflict in the country, then the country would be in a better position to project itself on the international stage. Then again, the values, the talents, the experience, the personality cult of the leadership, it also matters. Leadership, yeah, the leader, as I have in one of my previous talks, I have discussed that thing, that if a charismatic leadership is there in a country, so it will, and people follow that leadership, then whatever policy options that leadership come up with, they would be accepted by the people very easily, right? And it is the values and the talent and the experience of that leadership which basically influences, or these values, these experiences, these talents, they influence the foreign policy of a country, right? And it is not only the leadership who is on top of the country, it is the diplomats who are in the foreign policy formulation process, who are involved in this foreign policy formulation process. So these the personality of the leadership, it matters. You can see that whenever a leadership, whenever we see a change in the leadership in any given country, we see a change in the foreign policy, a slight change, like the larger picture or the strategic objective of the foreign policy is there to achieve its national interest, so it is there, those goals are there, but the means which are adopted in order to achieve those objectives, they change, they vary from leadership to leadership. And we have seen that whenever a new leadership comes, you can see a visible change in the foreign policy of the United States of America, even the United States of America, right? That you can see the foreign policy of George W. Bush towards Afghanistan and towards other international issues the world was facing. Then you can see the foreign policy on environment of the foreign policy of Barack Obama on the issue of international environment or environmental issues, global environmental issues. And we saw a complete, you might call it a U-turn by Donald Trump, because Donald Trump did not approve of all the measures which had been taken by the previous administration in order to arrest the emission of carbon dioxide and save the environment of the globe. He did not approve of that thing. So that is why we can see that these changes and these leadership, they matter. In Pakistan, it is again the same case. I have already quoted the example of Pervez Musharraf. You can again think about his policies, and it was the leadership, it was his own intellect, his own values, his own talent, which convinced him, which not only convinced him, but he was able to convince the rest of his political opponents to adopt a foreign policy towards Afghanistan, which we saw that he had adopted. So it wouldn't have been possible under any other leadership. You can call, like, had it been a democratic leadership, a democratic setup at that time in Pakistan, so we would have seen, maybe we would have seen a different approach towards the US pressure after the 9/11, but we did not see that. So it is the leadership. Then political accountability also matters. So if a country is open, if democratic processes are working in that country, the foreign policy, the diplomacy or the foreign policy or the foreign ministers, the foreign ministry, it is also under check by the public. So if this political accountability is there, if the executive is asked about his foreign policy measures, then we might see some sort of, we can see a better foreign policy when we compare it with most of the autocratic governments. So we can see that. But then there is an example of India right now, the Chinese-Indian face-off. In this, you can see that the Indian administration or the Indian executive branch of the government, Narendra Modi and co., they are quite under pressure by the opposition right now because of their foreign policy measures which they had been taking over the past couple of months or years now, you can say that. So they are now under check, they are now under pressure from the opposition, and they will somehow correct their course of action. But on the other hand, in most of the cases, autocratic government might not be under check, and there is a likelihood that they might take a wrong foreign policy decision. But in case of China, up till now, we are seeing that, from 1949 up till now, in case of China, we are seeing that though there is an autocratic government, but still Chinese foreign policy approach is very sound towards different international issues, and they have achieved whatever they have achieved up till now, economically and militarily, whatever strength they have gained, it was their wise foreign policy approach though without any check by the public, because there is a one-party system and autocratic government, but still, so exceptions are always there. You cannot say that this is the only right course of action. Exceptions are always there. And other aspect is that of ideology. Ideology also plays a very important role in the foreign policy formulation of a country. Take the example of the United States of America. The United States of America puts under ban a lot of autocratic regime because it thinks that it is not a democratic country. So it would put that regime under economic sanctions. This democracy and these values, they are kind of the ideology of the United States of America. So that is why the United States of America adopts or projects its ideology in its foreign policy approach. Its foreign policy is always good and friendly towards those countries who have got the same values as the United States of America or the same ideology as the United States of America. So its foreign policy is good towards them. And then there is an approach in foreign policy of each state, that each state tries to impress upon the rest of the countries that their ideology is better, and the rest of the countries should also consider their ideology and make some amends in the ideologies in order to get some benefits or gain something out of the gains or something which this country has gained. So the other countries should also consider these ideologies, and their ideology is like supreme and this and that. So they try to promote their ideology, and it is the case with almost all the countries, right? Whenever a person or a country believes in something, so then they try to propagate it, right? So, and convince people that their ideology is the right one. So this is, and in ideology it is not only related to faith, it might be capitalist ideology or communism and this and that. So you can see that these things are there. Then what is the quality of diplomacy in that country? Like diplomacy is, I have already mentioned that it is the arm of the government through which the foreign policy or the policy of a country runs. Right, so like the policy of country runs through diplomacy to other countries. It is like this. So if this diplomacy is strong, if it has adopted sound practices, if it has developed good habits, good virtues, good conventions are there in diplomacy, so then the foreign policy of that country would be implemented in a better way. And it will not only implement it in a better way, but it will also influence the foreign policy. Now, how it will influence the foreign policy? If you remember in one of my previous talks under the diplomacy, I have told you that in the responsibilities of the diplomats or the functions of the diplomats, the lecture which, the second last lecture, you know, not the one which you just studied, but just the first part of diplomacy. If you go through that, I have told you that diplomats also do reporting to their home country. So when they do reporting to the home country, they kind of give information to the home country about the host country, and then the home country makes its foreign policy for the host country, taking into account the information which have already been sent by the diplomats through their reports to the home country. So this is when a diplomat reports the condition of the host country to the home country, and then the foreign policy is made on the basis of those reports towards the host country. So this diplomacy is a determinant of the foreign policy. It becomes a determinant of the foreign policy in this regard as well. I hope I have made this point clear. Okay, then what is the power structure or the global environment or the global strategic environment? So it also determines the foreign policy of a country, because one state has got relations with another state and then they try to achieve their national interest. The other state has got relation with other state and they are kind of interconnected, you know. So sorry, this complex situation is developed, and in the process a few states emerge as great states or powerful countries. So when they emerge as great states or powerful countries, the power poles are made on the world stage, and then this becomes the power structure on the world stage. So when this becomes the power structure on the world stage, this power structure also determines the foreign policy of many countries, right? Take the example of the Cold War. There were two power poles. One was led by the USSR, the other one was led by the United States of America. And the foreign policies of the rest of the world, most of the countries in the world, were determined or were influenced by either one pole or the other pole, one actor, one global player or the other global player. So these foreign policies were determined by the global power structure. I hope I have made this point clear. So the foreign policies of these small states are somehow determined by the power structure at international stage. And then the public opinion, this public opinion is national as well as international. So the public opinion also determines the foreign policy of a country. And the foreign policy, I have also in some of my previous talks I have told you that even the world public opinion, the foreign policies of a particular country might be influenced by the world public opinion. Right? So if there is a global drive towards taking measures about the protection of environment, so none of the powerful countries can deny this, because there is a global drive and the world public opinion is demanding it. So even the powerful states would adopt measures which the world public opinion is demanding, because under the pressure from the world public opinion, and likewise from the national opinion, right? So it is national and international. And there are many examples again, like disarmament, arms control. It was under pressure from the world public opinion that these two powerful countries, the United States of America and Soviet Union, they agreed for disarmament and the arms controls agreements in the 1970s. Then anti-apartheid policies, so these in South Africa or against the blacks. So these policies were, changed because of the world public, under the pressure or the influence of the world public opinion. So this world public opinion matters a lot. So technology is also a determinant of the foreign policy of a country. If a country is technologically advanced, it will have an edge over other countries, and it will be more aggressive in its foreign policy. Like for example, if a country is advanced in military technology, in war technology, so like the United States of America or the Soviet Union, so they are technologically advanced and their war technology is really, these technologies are really advanced. So you can see the aggressive postures of these countries in their foreign policy, and it gives them an edge. This technological advancement gives an edge to the technologically advanced countries against the technologically less developed countries. Then external environment is, like for example, if there is a revolution in your neighborhood, it will also determine your foreign policy. It will have an influence over your foreign policy. And if there is a dispute between two countries in the neighborhood, in that region, so that dispute would also influence or determine your foreign policy. Like take the example of the foreign policy of Nepal right now towards India, because of the dispute between India and China. So you will come to know that these disputes, they also influence, they are some of the influencing factors of the foreign policy of a country. Another external factor is that of, for example, if the international currency is devalued or appreciated or depreciated, your currency is depreciated or appreciated against international currency due to some factors. So these are also some of the external factors which influence, which determine your foreign policy. Right? And then you will have to be on good terms with other countries, or you will have to adopt some other measures in order to come out of that fix in which you are in due to these external issues. And The nature of alliances and treaties at international level, they also determine the foreign policy of different countries, because these alliances are made by the weak countries or by different countries to pool their power together against an adversary or in a specific or particular situation. So these alliances are there and they agree. I have already explained some of the alliances, the nature of alliances, so I have already discussed that thing. So I think that I do not need to go into the detail what an alliance is, but you know the alliance. And you can take the example of the Cold War from 1945 to 1990. In this, these alliances played a huge role, like the Warsaw Pact. The NATO was on one side and the Warsaw Pact was on another side. Warsaw Pact was determining the policies of Soviet satellite states, the allies of Soviet Union, and the NATO was determining the policies or the foreign policies of those countries which were pro-capitalist, right? So this is, I think this was all about it. And then again, another example of the NATO was that all the NATO countries, when they decided that they are going to back the US action in Afghanistan against the Taliban government, so all the foreign policies of all of the NATO member states were governed by their alliance, which was NATO, right? So all of them took an action in Afghanistan and their foreign policies were governed by these alliances. And then there are trading blocs all around the world, like ASEAN is there, NAFTA is there, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is there, European Union is the biggest example. So the economic or the trade policies of the member countries of these countries are run by or governed by or influenced by or determined by these economic or trade blocs or their alliances in these blocs. So you can you can easily now understand that how alliances or blocs or treaties influence or determine the foreign policies of different countries, right? So these are all of like some of the major determinants. These were some of the major determinants of foreign policy which influence the foreign policy, but you need to keep in mind that none of these determinants are independent. None of them can independently influence the foreign policy. It is always a combination of different factors, or all these factors which I have elaborated. It is always the combination of these factors. They are dependent on one another, and only then the foreign policy is formulated. If you have got any question regarding this topic, you can post your question in the comment section under this video. And if you are my direct student, even then I would advise that you post the question under the comment section in this video. So I will read your question before the class, and during the class I will try to address those questions directly, rather than waiting for you to raise the question during the class. So it will be quite convenient for me and for you as well, that I will not be asking even my direct student one by one during that online session for their queries and questions. Thank you very much for watching.